Have you ever wondered how much blood and how many shattered lives are hidden behind the dazzling smiles of those we're used to worshiping as screen gods? In Hollywood's golden age, entire armies of studio cleaners and fixers worked around the clock to keep drunken sadism, theft, and the rotten cores of the Olympus dwellers safely out of your sight. While the voice, Frank Sinatra, was allegedly putting hits out on managers who displeased him, and Marlon Brando was turning film sets into parades of bare backsides, the system did everything it could to keep these monsters untouchable. Today, we're finally ripping the masks off those who stole safety from their women and crippled their co-stars for the sake of another Oscar or a passing whim. Buckle up, my lovers of scandal, because the truth the studios locked away in secret archives for decades is far filthier than any yellowed tabloid ever dared to print. But before we get to our first star, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit like, and leave a comment. Enjoy the show. Frank Sinatra. Meet Old Blue Eyes, the legendary crooner, and at the same time, a full-blown egocentric monster, Frank Sinatra. If you thought Frank was just a sweet guy crooning about love under the moon, then you clearly aren't Carl Cohen, the manager of the Sands Casino in Las Vegas. One fine day, Sinatra decided he was so great that the casino ought to hand him $50,000 worth of free chips simply for existing. When Cohen, who had the audacity to follow the rules, refused this deity, Frank flew into such a rage that he jumped straight onto a blackjack table. Later, when Cohen tried to smooth things over peacefully, Sinatra didn't hesitate. He poured a cup of scalding coffee straight into the man's lap. After receiving a well-earned punch to the jaw in return, Frank didn't go to the police. He went to his friends in the mob. Yes, Sinatra seriously tried to have Cohen killed. Luckily for the manager, the mobsters were smarter than the singer and refused to dirty their hands for a spoiled star, reasonably concluding that a crooner is not a made man. But the Sands saga didn't end there. After losing $500,000 at the casino, apparently the lack of free chips hurt his karma, a drunken Sinatra stole a golf cart, smashed it through the glass entrance, and tried to set the casino curtains on fire with his lighter. A true divine performance, nothing less. Sinatra saw himself not just as a star, but as a shadow power behind the White House. He prepared an entire entourage for President John Kennedy's visit to his California estate and even built a helicopter pad. But when Kennedy, having heard enough about Frank's mob ties, chose to stay with Bing Crosby instead, Sinatra completely lost it. He didn't just sulk, he went on a rampage. Frank reduced the presidential apartments to splinters, destroyed every photograph with JFK, and then grabbed a sledgehammer and personally demolished the very helicopter pad he had built. If the president wouldn't land at a god's house, then the landing pad would cease to exist. On the set of Guys and Dolls in 1955, two colossal egos collided, Sinatra and Brando. Frank was furious that Brando, just some serious actor with no singing voice, got the lead while he himself was pushed aside. Sinatra openly called Marlon Mumbles and the most overrated actor in the world. Professional ethics? Never heard of them. Sinatra, proud of delivering his scenes in a single take, would ostentatiously leave the set as soon as his shots were done, forcing Brando to act opposite a wall. He even tried to sabotage Brando's career through his Paramount connections when Marlon was being considered for The Godfather because he saw Johnny Fontaine as a malicious parody of himself. And on the set of Four for Texas, Sinatra decided work was for the common folk. He bothered to put in only 80 hours for the entire shoot, driving director Aldrich to the brink with his aggressive and humiliating behavior. Aldrich seriously considered taking the god to court. Sinatra's personal life played out like a thriller as well. When his wife, Mia Farrow, dared to choose her career and a role in Rosemary's Baby instead of sitting at his feet, Sinatra sent his lawyer to serve divorce papers right on set. Mia signed them between takes while Frank lectured about how his mother would never approve of her devilish roles. Sinatra loved humiliating those who couldn't fight back. He could hurl a water pitcher at a jazz drummer's head over a bad solo, or pay a waiter to slap a journalist he didn't like. But his strangest hobby was throwing things into swimming pools. Broken TV? Into the pool. Phone not working? Rip it out of the wall and into the pool. Once he even threatened to toss his assistant into the water because there was a crease in his shirt. Frank Sinatra was a musical genius, but behind that genius stood a man who stole dignity from everyone around him and believed the entire world was his personal doormat. He died leaving behind great songs and hundreds of ruined reputations. So, tell me, friends, do you still feel like singing along to My Way, or does the image of the chairman of the board no longer seem so shiny? Let us know in the comments what you think of Frank's antics.
Marlon Brando. If in the first chapter we talked about Sinatra, who mostly wanted to kill everyone, today we move on to the heavy artillery, to a man officially regarded as the industry's gold standard of the actor from hell. Meet Marlon Brando, a genius, a rebel, and a man whose ego was so vast it seemed to require its own soundstage. He didn't merely play roles, he turned the lives of everyone on set into an elaborate psychological endurance test, hiding behind his status as an untouchable. Have you ever wondered why Brando so often stared off to the side or thoughtfully lowered his eyes on camera? Fans called it deep immersion in character, but the reality was far more mundane. The great master simply couldn't be bothered to memorize his lines. On the set of The Godfather and many other films, assistants were forced to hang cue cards everywhere, on lamps, on furniture, even on the chests of other actors. Brando insisted that memorizing words killed spontaneity, but his colleagues understood perfectly well. The maestro just didn't care about their time or effort. He turned filmmaking into a glorified read-through, forcing cinematographers to invent absurd camera angles so the cheat sheets wouldn't slip into frame. If you think the making of the most serious film in cinema history, The Godfather, took place in an atmosphere of reverence, you're badly mistaken. Brando and his younger disciples, including James Caan and Robert Duvall, created pure pandemonium on set. To shake off nerves, the actors began dropping their pants en masse and flashing each other during rehearsals and takes. The outbreak of exhibitionism grew so widespread that, according to eyewitnesses, a bare backside seemed to be waiting for you behind every closed door. Brando himself, who had tolerated these antics for a while, eventually decided to deliver a crushing blow to the youngsters' egos. On the 44th day of shooting, during the massive wedding scene, the master suddenly turned around and exposed himself to the entire crew, including 500 extras. The cast and crew were so impressed by this performance that they later presented him with a ceremonial belt engraved "Champion Ass." While director Francis Ford Coppola was busy sleeping on friends' couches, anticipating his inevitable firing, Brando was busy turning a future cinematic masterpiece into an oversized kindergarten. We mentioned their rivalry in the first chapter, but from Brando's side it bordered on refined sadism. Marlon knew perfectly well that Sinatra hated rehearsals and always delivered his best work in the very first take. So, during their shared scenes in Guys and Dolls, Brando deliberately botched his lines precisely when Frank was at his peak. This forced the voice to repeat the same scene 10 or 20 times, which for him was the equivalent of torture by hot iron. Brando would merely smile innocently as Sinatra stormed off to his trailer in a rage, hurling curses over his shoulder and calling his rival a mumbling hack. There were moments, however, when Brando's creative experiments crossed every boundary of basic human decency. The incident on the set of Last Tango in Paris still sends a chill down the spine of any normal person. Brando and director Bernardo Bertolucci agreed to improvise during an intimate scene without warning the 19-year-old actress Maria Schneider. Later, she admitted that she felt humiliated and effectively violated because Brando used his power to force a genuine reaction out of her. Marlon, of course, considered it great art. After all, the feelings of a god always mattered more than the dignity of some novice. The end of Brando's career was just as chaotic as his personality. On the set of The Island of Dr. Moreau, he encountered a worthy opponent, Val Kilmer, who had already earned a reputation as a difficult child. The two of them turned the production into a war zone, ignoring the director and competing to see who could be more unbearable. Brando would sit in his trailer for hours with a bucket of ice on his head, refusing to come out until Kilmer apologized for his very existence. It was the sunset of an era in which genius served as a free pass for any kind of rudeness and madness. Marlon Brando died, leaving behind a great trail of roles and hundreds of shattered psychological defenses among his colleagues. He truly believed he was a god, and gods, as we know, don't need to learn their lines or ask permission from mere mortals. So, tell me, my dear readers, how do you like our champion of bare backsides? Do you think playing Vito Corleone excuses tormenting an entire film crew? Write in the comments which episode from Brando's life shocked you the most, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel.
Alfred Hitchcock. Have you ever wondered why the dazzling blondes in Alfred Hitchcock's films look so genuinely terrified? Here's a hint. It wasn't always great acting. More often than not, it was raw animal fear of a man who crowned himself a god on set and openly declared that actors should be treated like cattle. Today, we tear the mask off this so-called genius and reveal how behind the facade of a jovial, harmless fat man lurked a calculating predator and outright sadist, a man who stole women's dignity, safety, and careers to feed his own diseased fantasies. The most horrifying story Hollywood executives tried to bury in studio vaults for years unfolded during the filming of the legendary thriller The Birds in 1963. A young actress, Tippi Hedren, had the misfortune of becoming the object of Hitchcock's obsessive fixation. This master made crude, unmistakable advances toward her, and when he received a firm refusal, his genius instantly curdled into refined cruelty. Hitchcock decided to punish the woman who dared say no to a Hollywood god. In one of the film's most terrifying scenes, he promised to use mechanical birds, but at the last moment, without warning the actress, he replaced them with live, enraged crows and seagulls. For 5 days, Tippi was subjected to real torture. Birds were hurled at her face, pecking her skin, clawing at her eyes. When the bleeding actress finally collapsed from exhaustion and was taken to the hospital with serious injuries, Hitchcock merely watched with cold amusement, savoring the fact that he had extracted a natural reaction from his victim. This was not directing. This was a premeditated assault staged under the gaze of movie cameras. But the abuse on set was only the beginning. Hitchcock believed he owned not just an actress's body on screen, but her entire life. After Hedren definitively refused to become his puppet, our genius chose to steal her right to a profession. Exploiting his near-absolute power in the industry, he blocked her access to serious roles for years, effectively destroying her career at its peak. He turned the filmmaking process into a prison, surrounding his stars with an atmosphere of total hostility and psychological terror. If you think Tippi Hedren was his only victim, you don't know our master very well. Hitchcock took pleasure in engineering situations designed to humiliate. On the set of The 39 Steps, actress Madeleine Carroll handcuffed her to her co-star and then casually announced that he had lost the key. The woman spent several agonizing hours in restraints, bruised and publicly humiliated. The entire spectacle existed solely for Hitchcock's personal amusement. He relished watching people suffer when they were completely at the mercy of his whims. So, tell me, friends, how do the masterpieces of the brilliant Alfred Hitchcock look to you now? Is art really worth such human sacrifice? Or should these films have long ago been stamped with a warning, made by a sadist? Share your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe talent excuses cruelty?
Joan Crawford. You would never believe what an icy abyss and pure distilled sadism hid behind the dazzling smile of the woman who became the face of Hollywood's golden age and the Pepsi-Cola Corporation. Joan Crawford was not merely an actress. She was a perfectly engineered product of the studio system, a woman who believed in her own divinity and demanded the same faith from everyone around her. Today, we tear the mask from the noble lady and reveal how this Hollywood icon stole childhood from her own children and turned her colleagues' lives into a full-fledged branch of hell on earth. On screen, Crawford was always the embodiment of willpower, determination, and flawless style. MGM sculpted her into a goddess. She changed her name, born Lucille Fay LeSueur, reinvented her biography, and became a symbol of endurance. But behind that polished facade lurked a pathological perfectionist whose pursuit of excellence bordered on madness. On set, she demanded absolute control over every breath the crew took and mercilessly berated anyone who failed to meet her impossible standards. Colleagues recalled that Joan didn't simply ask for discipline, she terrorized those beneath her, regularly driving makeup artists and costume designers to hysteria and tears with her venomous remarks and impossible demands. The real shock came after the star's death, when her adopted daughter, Christina, published her memoir, Mommy Dearest. It turned out that behind the closed doors of her luxurious mansion, the divine Joan transformed into a monster who subjected her children to years of physical and emotional abuse. The story of the wire hangers spread around the world. Crawford could beat her daughter nearly unconscious simply for daring to hang an expensive dress on a cheap hanger. Her motherhood was just another role performed for the public, while in reality she robbed her children of safety and love, turning their lives into a psychological thriller. Even her son, Christopher, later confirmed that their mother's energy was destructive and terrifying, like a deranged character from a horror film. And if you think Crawford saved her cruelty for home, take a look at her professional life. Her feud with Bette Davis became a Hollywood legend and the ultimate template for female malice. They hated each other for decades, squabbling over men like Franchot Tone and trading poisonous barbs in the press. When the two faded divas finally met on the set of the 1962 thriller Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, the production turned into a combat zone. Crawford knew that Davis suffered from serious back problems, so what did Our Lady do? In the scene where Bette had to drag her across the floor, Joan deliberately wore a weightlifter's belt stuffed with lead, making herself as heavy as possible so her rival would be in real pain. She sabotaged takes by coughing at the most critical moments, deliberately exhausting Davis. Bette didn't hold back either. During the beating scene, she landed a blow so well placed that Crawford needed stitches, though Davis innocently claimed, "I barely touched her." The pinnacle of Crawford's cynicism came on Oscar night in 1963. Davis was the favorite and was already preparing to accept the award, but Joan pulled off the boldest act of sabotage in film history. She had called the other nominees who couldn't attend and offered to accept their awards on their behalf. When the winner's name was announced, not Davis, Crawford triumphantly swept past her crimson-faced rival and tossed out, "Sorry, I have to collect an Oscar." She stole Bette's moment, turning someone else's victory into her own personal spectacle. But everything has a price. By the end of her life, this queen had become so calculating and cold that she even turned her husband's tragedy into a business opportunity. When producer Walter Wonger shot her agent in a jealous rage, Joan showed no sympathy for the victim and instead used the scandal to negotiate more favorable contracts. She was willing to trade in blood and disgrace just to stay afloat. In the end, this queen spent her final years in chilling isolation, forgotten by the world and despised by her own children. She believed her status as a goddess gave her the right to break lives and steal dignity from anyone who stood in her shadow. History delivered its verdict. Today, she is remembered not as a great actress, but as Mommy Dearest, a name synonymous with tyranny. She wanted eternal glory and received eternal contempt. But this is nothing compared to how venomous Joan's supposed victim could be, the very same Bette Davis. You thought she was just an innocent target? Oh no. Our next heroine possessed a tongue sharper than a scalpel and a temperament that drove directors to quit mid-shoot. Bette Davis believed she was the only true actress on Olympus and tolerated no competition whatsoever. Write in the comments whose side you were on in this great battle, Crawford or Davis. Do you see Joan's behavior as justified perfectionism or pure sadism?
Bette Davis. Have you ever wondered why people in Hollywood still lower their voices when they hear the name Bette Davis? If you thought Joan Crawford was the pinnacle of malice, then you've clearly never seen the so-called First Lady of the American screen in action, a woman who could turn any film set into scorched earth. Today, we rip the mask off this sacred cow of classic cinema and show you the woman whose arrogance was so toxic that even the formidable Faye Dunaway looks like an innocent child by comparison. Brace yourselves, my lovers of scandal, because behind the legendary stare known as the Bette Davis eyes hid a true tyrant who stole the very right to dignity from everyone unfortunate enough to fall under her shadow. Bette Davis didn't just play roles, she ruled the set with the elegance of a Banana Republic dictator. Her perfectionism, praised by critics as genius, often manifested as outright sadism toward the crew. There are countless stories of Davis reducing colleagues to tears, demanding the immediate firing of makeup artists or lighting technicians over the slightest, sometimes entirely imagined mistakes. She was one of the most terrifying actresses of her era, and her authority allowed her to destroy careers with the snap of her fingers. If you failed to meet her high standards, you effectively ceased to exist in the industry. But if you think Bette limited herself to shouting matches, you are deeply mistaken. Davis was notorious for crossing every conceivable boundary on set. She adored realism, and under that pretext, she deliberately struck her scene partners. The most infamous incident occurred during the filming of Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, when, in a beating scene, she landed such a convincing blow to the head of her sworn enemy, Joan Crawford, that Crawford required stitches. Bette, of course, didn't even consider apologizing, calmly declaring, "I barely touched her." This wasn't acting, it was open aggression disguised as artistic method. The feud between Davis and Crawford was mere gossip. It was a textbook example of Hollywood rot. They despised each other for decades, from competing over men to arguing about whose children were more ungrateful. When they ended up at Warner Brothers in the 1940s, Crawford tried to placate Bette with flowers, only to have them returned with venomous remarks about lesbian advances. During the filming of Baby Jane in 1962, their hatred reached its peak. Bette made no effort to hide her cruelty, loudly calling Joan a fake bitch, making sure she heard every word. She stole every possible second of screen time from Crawford, determined to make her look as grotesque as possible. Bette behaved like a petulant deity, demanding that director Aldrich report to her on every move her rival made. Bette was a master of backstage warfare. She feuded for years with Miriam Hopkins, deliberately blocking cameras with her body so Hopkins wouldn't make it into the frame, and demanding endless script rewrites to inflate her own role. But the bitterest reckoning came on Oscar night in 1963. Bette was certain she would win for her role as Jane. She even had her purse ready for the walk to the stage. What she didn't know was that Crawford had orchestrated a quiet conspiracy, arranging with other nominees to accept the award on their behalf. When Bette heard that she had lost and watched Crawford pass by her saying, "Sorry, I have to go collect my Oscar," her fury was matched only by her humiliation. There were no winners in that war, only two deeply unhappy, deeply angry women stealing the last scraps of fame from each other.
You thought only Crawford had trouble with her children? Oh, Bette Davis could easily outdo her. Her own daughter, B.D. Hyman, later wrote a book accusing her mother of monstrous emotional abuse and tyranny. It turned out the great actress was just as despotic at home as she was at work, demanding absolute obedience and controlling her family with a chilling severity. With age, her bitterness only deepened, turning her into a caricature of herself. She believed her status as an idol entitled her to any cruelty, and in the end, she was left in frightening isolation, surrounded only by the ghosts of her enemies. Of course, Bette's fans still insist she was a fighter for actors' rights because she sued studios for the freedom to choose her roles. But look at it from another angle. She robbed producers and directors of peace simply because her ego couldn't fit inside a contract. She was Hollywood's problem child, not out of principle, but out of a pathological need for total control. By the end of her life, she had become so poisonous that colleagues simply refused to greet her. So tell me, friends, do you still see the Bette Davis eyes as a symbol of nobility? Or do you now catch the glint of that very volcano that destroyed dozens of lives for the sake of her own legend? Let us know in the comments whose cruelty shocked you more, Crawford's or Davis's.
Errol Flynn. You would never believe what a toxic abyss and distilled sadism lurked behind the dazzling smile of the man we were taught to see as the noble Robin Hood. Today, we rip the mask off the chief hero of classical Hollywood, Errol Flynn, whose real life would have made even his screen villains recoil in horror. Brace yourself. This so-called celestial being officially tops the list of the most cruel actors in film history, and his off-screen exploits were hidden for decades in studio vaults sealed tight. To understand how Flynn got away with everything, you have to grasp how the Star Factory worked in those years. It wasn't just filmmaking. It was an industrial assembly line for manufacturing gods and goddesses for public consumption. Studio bosses like Louis B. Mayer owned their actors through ironclad contracts, controlling every breath they took. MGM, for example, maintained its own private police force larger than that of many cities, and its primary job wasn't to keep order, but to clean up the rot inside its stars. Specialized fixers bribed cops, intimidated witnesses, and even arranged convenient accidents for those who refused to stay silent. For decades, we admired Errol, unaware that behind his image stood an entire army of people whose sole purpose was to clean up after him, both literally and figuratively. The most disgraceful episode in our hero's biography came in 1942, when the world learned about his true appetites. Behind the scenes, the noble swashbuckler favored extremely young victims. He was put on trial for the abuse of 2 underage girls. The case became a national sensation. Half the country demanded his imprisonment, while the other half lined up for his autograph. Although brilliant lawyers kept Flynn out of jail, the scandal permanently altered his image, giving rise to the poisonous saying, "In like Flynn," which was never about luck at all, but about his indiscriminate behavior. Warner Brothers even maintained a special black fund, money quietly used to silence new victims of this serial predator. And if you think his cruelty was confined to his private life, take a look at his professional conduct. Flynn was a sadist on set. Actresses Ida Lupino and Ann Sheridan lived in a constant state of fear while working with him. Lupino later admitted to friends that Errol would lie in wait for her in isolated parts of the set when the lights and cameras turned away, and his behavior was anything but gentlemanly. He was no less merciless with men, especially those he saw as rivals. Flynn delighted in deliberately missing his mark during sword-fighting scenes, inflicting real injuries on his partners. He intentionally wounded Basil Rathbone simply because he could. His pranks were closer to torture. Once he invited a young, desperate actor onto his yacht, promised to help his career, and then abandoned the poor man in the middle of the ocean without food or water. Fishermen rescued him hours later, while Flynn laughed it off, calling it a great joke.
The darkness in his soul was so dense that even his hard-drinking colleagues from his so-called most brutal club, men like Humphrey Bogart and Mickey Rooney, sometimes recoiled at his behavior. Beyond alcohol and violence, Flynn was suspected of Nazi sympathies and even espionage, completing the portrait of a man for whom no moral boundary existed. He burned through life as if trying to outrun his reflection, and by 50, he had become a sick, bankrupt wreck. When Errol Flynn finally died, Hollywood did not fall in mourning. On the contrary, most insiders felt only immense relief that this man could no longer harm anyone. He stole safety from the women in his life, fair play from his colleagues, and truth from his audience, leaving behind nothing but a trail of shattered lives and studio-paid silences. So tell me, friends, do you still feel like re-watching The Adventures of Robin Hood? Or does every swing of his sword remind you of those he maimed for his own amusement? Write in the comments, should talent on this level serve as absolution for a maniac? Or did Flynn earn his place in oblivion?
Gene Kelly. Have you ever wondered why Gene Kelly smiles so radiantly as he splashes through puddles in the legendary musical Singin' in the Rain? Here's a hint. It was his greatest acting triumph, because behind that dazzling grin hid a ruthless overseer whose obsession with perfection bordered on outright sadism. Today, we tear the mask off this so-called sunny guy and show you the real Gene Kelly, a man who turned film sets into tap-dancing concentration camps, stealing from his partners not only their strength, but their faith in themselves. Brace yourselves, because this triple threat, singer, dancer, actor, was in fact a triple threat to the mental health of anyone unlucky enough to fall under his shadow. To understand how Kelly became a tyrant, you have to remember the world he lived in. In Hollywood's golden age, studios like MGM didn't just make movies, they manufactured gods and goddesses for public consumption. Actors were bound by ironclad contracts controlling every step they took, and studio bosses like Louis B. Mayer could end a career with a single phone call. But Gene Kelly didn't merely survive in this system, he became its perfect enforcement tool. While audiences saw a reformer of the musical genre, his colleagues saw an indefatigable perfectionist whose demands went far beyond reason. He didn't see collaborators, he saw functions meant to be worked to exhaustion for the sake of his personal triumph. If you thought his dances looked effortless, know this, they were soaked in the sweat and blood of those he drove past their limits. The most famous victim of his despotism was 19-year-old Debbie Reynolds during the filming of Singin' in the Rain. Imagine it, a young, inexperienced girl falling into the hands of a man she idolized. Instead of mentorship, she received what she later described as an exhausting and traumatizing ordeal. Kelly pushed her to the brink, reducing Debbie to tears again and again with relentless nitpicking and humiliating remarks. The climax of this creative process came during rehearsals for a complex dance number, when Kelly forced the girl to repeat the routine over and over, ignoring her complaints of pain. In the end, Reynolds was made to dance until her feet literally began to bleed. And what did our genius do then? Show compassion? Hardly. According to those who witnessed it, Kelly displayed a complete lack of empathy for his colleagues' suffering. To him, his partner's bloodied feet were nothing more than an inconvenient obstacle on the road to the perfect take. If you think Kelly terrorized only newcomers, look at how he treated established star Esther Williams on the set of Take Me Out to the Ball Game. It turned out that behind the facade of the confident macho man lurked someone deeply insecure and fiercely competitive. Kelly was terrified that anyone might outshine him, even physically. Esther Williams's height enraged him, so much that he resorted to petty cruelty. Kelly demanded that she slouch during their scenes together, just so the great Gene would appear taller and more imposing on screen. This wasn't about finding a better camera angle, it was deliberate humiliation, meant to soothe his swollen ego.
He fostered a tense, hostile atmosphere on set where everyone was expected to remember one thing: there was only one God here, and his name was Gene Kelly. So tell me, my friends, how does this man singing in the rain look to you now? Do you still believe great art excuses shattered lives and bloodied feet? Or does his image now seem as fake as that Hollywood smile? Write in the comments whether you knew about the dark side of this god of the musical and whose story shocked you more, Debbie Reynolds or Esther Williams's.
Today, we tear the mask off the man whose little tramp became a universal symbol of kindness, compassion, and innocence. Behind the scenes, however, this genius of silent cinema was anything but a saint. If you thought his life played out like one of his light-hearted comedies, you were gravely mistaken. Charlie Chaplin is a case study in how great art can conceal a domineering, controlling despot with habits that today would land him behind bars faster than he could twirl his famous cane. Chaplin revolutionized cinema, giving the world The Tramp and masterpieces like City Lights and The Great Dictator. To audiences everywhere, he was a champion of the poor and the oppressed. In reality, he was often the chief oppressor of those unfortunate enough to belong to his inner circle. Hollywood at the time thrived on the star system, a relentless machine for manufacturing gods and goddesses for public consumption. Studios spent millions to conceal the rot beneath their idols, crafting flawless images. Chaplin was a master of this illusion, yet his private life was so riddled with scandal and filth that even Hollywood's formidable publicity engine could not always silence the witnesses. One of the darkest and most disturbing aspects of Chaplin was his unhealthy, pathological fixation on women far younger than himself. His first and second wives, Mildred Harris and Leda Gray, were still teenagers when this so-called great humanist led them to the altar. Hollywood gossip whispered about his predatory tendencies, and those whispers had substance. Chaplin used his status and power to manipulate young women who looked at him as if he were a god. This was not love, it was a hunger for total control. Behind closed doors, Chaplin's marriages were described as emotionally abusive and tyrannical. He didn't merely demand attention, he demanded complete submission. He cultivated an atmosphere of psychological chaos, turning the lives of the women around him into an endless drama staged under his rigid direction. His controlling nature knew no limits, and any hint of independence from his partners triggered fits of rage and calculated manipulation. In the 1940s, Chaplin's image as the benevolent clown finally began to crack. A sensational paternity lawsuit filed by actress Joan Barry exposed details of his intimate life that left America stunned. Although Chaplin was legally cleared of paternity, the trial laid bare humiliating aspects of his behavior that permanently stained his reputation. The courtroom revealed a man prone to coercion, emotional abuse, and cynical games with other people's feelings. It was a moment of truth. The Tramp was unmasked as a calculating manipulator who believed that law and morality did not apply to him. Chaplin became so convinced of his own untouchability that he began openly playing political games that ultimately destroyed him. During the Red Scare, he was accused of sympathizing with communism, drawing the attention and hostility of the authorities and the FBI. Instead of exercising caution, he responded with his trademark arrogance, convinced that his global fame was an impenetrable shield. He was wrong. His egocentrism and belief in his own omnipotence led to a quiet but decisive outcome. Chaplin was effectively shown the door. He was forced to leave the United States and spent the rest of his life in exile in Switzerland. The political uproar was only the tip of the iceberg of a complex and often repellent character. He created a myth of himself as a suffering genius, but history reveals a man who stole peace of mind from those closest to him and dignity from the women he treated as puppets. So tell me, friends, how do you feel about our saint Chaplin now? Do you still believe that brilliant humor excuses corruption and tyranny? Or do you think his exile from America was a deserved punishment, not for politics, but for moral decay? Write in the comments whether you knew that behind the tramp's mask hid a true great dictator of his own family.
Faye Dunaway. If you thought the previous figures were difficult people, then you've clearly never crossed paths with the woman whom the great Bette Davis officially called one of the worst human beings in the film industry. Meet Faye Dunaway, an icon of Hollywood's second golden age, whose on-screen brilliance always walked hand in hand with such extreme toxicity that colleagues preferred to stay 3 miles away from her. Faye Dunaway never hid the fact that she considered herself royalty by birth, a woman to whom the world owed everything by default. Her off-screen behavior often resembled a prolonged fit of megalomania mixed with absolute contempt for the feelings of others. A routine trip to the airport could turn into an epic spectacle. Employees at JFK still shudder when recalling how Faye unleashed a monumental tantrum demanding an upgrade to first class. She didn't ask, she screamed across the terminal, "Do you even know who I am?" as if her name were a magic password for free champagne and caviar. Most amusing of all, this divine attitude extended to everyone, from pilots to birds flying overhead. But if you think airport theatrics were the worst of it, buckle up. This is where it gets truly ugly. Faye's relationship with director Roman Polanski during the filming of the masterpiece Chinatown was so warm that Hollywood still whispers legends about her methods of revenge. According to persistent rumors, when Polanski once again refused to give her a bathroom break, Faye didn't hesitate. She allegedly filled a glass with her own urine and hurled it straight into the director's face, deciding that if she couldn't use a toilet, Polanski would make a fine substitute. Years later, whenever journalists dared to ask her about the incident, Faye instantly transformed into an offended paragon of virtue, snapping, "I am a lady and you are insulting me," before storming out of interviews faster than a paparazzo could press the shutter. The irony is that the most disastrous and at the same time most revealing role of her career was playing another of our heroines, Joan Crawford, in Mommy Dearest. Polanski later remarked with acid sarcasm that Dunaway's behavior on that set was the best proof of her madness. Faye became so consumed by the role of the monstrous mother that she began terrorizing her colleagues for real, without any script at all. Her co-star, Retanya Alda, still recalls the infamous take when Dunaway slapped her so hard she nearly flew into another soundstage. The blow wasn't scripted, and Alda was left in deep shock, realizing that brilliant Faye had simply decided to vent her rage on her. Working with Dunaway was like surviving at the epicenter of a natural disaster, unpredictable, loud, and emotionally exhausting. Crew members quit en masse, incapable of enduring her endless hysterics and towering arrogance. Even on the theater stage, she managed to create an atmosphere of total fear. She was fired from the Broadway production Tea at 5 after turning the staff's lives into hell. Faye threw objects at stagehands and reduced employees to tears with her relentless tirades. The final grotesque flourish came in the form of her personal habits, which even hardened Hollywood gossip mongers whispered about in disbelief. It was said that this lady had the habit of using trash bins in her dressing room instead of toilets and deliberately refused to flush public restrooms, as if leaving autographs of her greatness for the cleaning staff. Even her own son, Liam, admitted that her mood swings were disturbingly reminiscent of the very Joan Crawford she portrayed on screen.
In fairness, Faye was later diagnosed with bipolar disorder, which may partially explain her behavior. But does that excuse decades of humiliation inflicted on everyone beneath her on the social ladder? Even in old age, Dunaway never lost her diva's rage, continuing to lash out at photographers and insult journalists as if legendary status granted her a lifetime license for cruelty. She stole from people the right to work in peace and to basic human dignity, convinced that her talent was sufficient payment for every wound she left behind. So, tell me, my dear friends, how do you like our terrible Faye? Do you believe a diagnosis can excuse a glass of urine thrown in a director's face or slaps delivered to colleagues? Or do you think Dunaway simply believed too deeply in her exceptionalism?
Humphrey Bogart. We have reached the finale of our marathon of vanity, and for dessert we saved a figure many still regard as the gold standard of masculinity, the archetype of the old-school real man. Today, however, we tear the mask off Humphrey Bogart, a man whose tough guy screen persona was only the tip of an iceberg hiding a depth of bitterness, alcoholism, and very real everyday sadism. If you believed Bogart was as noble in life as Rick from Casablanca, then you clearly never worked with him on a set. Unlike colleagues who wore the mask of a god purely for publicity, Humphrey wore it because he genuinely despised anyone who failed to meet his personal standards of cool. Multiple accounts confirmed that Bogart was notorious for his drinking, which routinely fueled his malicious behavior toward those with less power. For him, alcohol was not a way to unwind, it was a license for cruelty. Once drunk, our hero turned into a venomous troll who took pleasure in singling out vulnerable members of the crew and humiliating them in public. He derived almost physical satisfaction from tormenting young actors he deemed privileged or soft. If you were a newcomer with good manners, Bogart did everything he could to make you feel like nothing, stealing your right to basic human dignity right there in front of the cameras. Things grew even uglier when Bogart joined forces with his drinking buddies. You've heard of Sinatra's Rat Pack? Forget it. They were choir boys compared to what contemporaries called the most brutal club in Hollywood. This cozy little circle included Humphrey Bogart, Mickey Rooney, and our #1 menace from earlier chapters, Errol Flynn. These three didn't just drink together, they used their combined star power to intimidate and silence anyone who dared speak out against their behavior. It was a full-fledged mafia within the industry. Imagine it, three deities capable of destroying your career with a single phone call, banding together to wreak havoc without consequence. They believed themselves untouchable, and the studio system did everything in its power to keep them that way. The private life of our resident cynic was no romantic ballad either. His marriage to actress Mayo Methot went down in history as the Battling Bogarts. These were not ordinary domestic arguments, it was a war zone soaked in gin and mutual hatred. Their public fights often turned physical, and Bogart was widely described as a man prone to violence in relationships. Even when he finally found supposed happiness with Lauren Bacall, who was said to have softened him, the bile inside him never disappeared. Bogart retained a deep-seated bitterness that revealed itself in his harsh treatment of colleagues he considered talentless or unworthy of success. He believed his talent gave him the right to judge and punish, and woe to anyone who failed to make it into his narrow circle of the chosen. You might ask how a man with such a reputation remained an icon. The answer is simple. The Star Factory worked flawlessly. In those days, studios didn't just employ actors, they owned them through ironclad contracts, controlling every breath they took.
Studio bosses like Louis B. Mayer treated stars as valuable commodities that had to be protected at any cost, regardless of their behavior. MGM even maintained its own private police force, larger than many small towns. Their job wasn't to keep order, but to clean up after the stars, bribing officers, threatening witnesses, and burying scandals. Specialized fixers like Eddie Mannix turned Bogart's sordid reality into a heroic myth, while he continued to terrorize his colleagues. Studios even created so-called containment sets, projects where all the problematic stars were deliberately gathered in one place so they could be monitored more easily. The most famous example was The Big Sleep in 1946, where Bogart and other difficult actors created an atmosphere crew members later described as the most hostile set in history. Humphrey Bogart died, leaving behind masterpieces of film noir and hundreds of people whose self-worth had been crushed under the weight of his divine arrogance. He stole from others their right to peace and professional respect, convinced that his status as a legend granted him immunity for any kind of cruelty.
Hollywood's golden age is remembered as a time of blinding glamour and carefully engineered images. But as we've seen, behind every perfect smile lurked a darkness studio bosses spent years burying in secret archives. This dream factory was not merely a film industry, it was an assembly line for mass-producing gods and goddesses for public consumption, where actors belonged to studios under ironclad contracts that controlled their every breath. To protect their valuable assets, industry monsters like MGM maintained private police forces larger than those of many small cities. Their real mission wasn't to keep order, but to clean up after the stars, bribing witnesses, intimidating victims, and covering up drunken sadism. For decades, we swallowed this glittering bait without realizing that every classic film tells two stories, the one we see on screen and the one that unfolded behind the camera, filled with psychological torture, exploitation, and the crushed dignity of those too powerless to fight back. History shows that fame and power only inflated the inner emptiness and narcissism of these people to planetary proportions, while their so-called genius served as the perfect camouflage for their most despicable acts. And as psychiatrists like to note, stories about narcissists never have happy endings. In the end, all of our idols found themselves in icy solitude, despised by colleagues and abandoned by their own families. It turns out the line between genius and monster is thinner than a layer of makeup on their faces. And today, by tearing off those masks, we finally pay tribute to the hundreds of nameless victims whose shattered lives became the price of our fleeting entertainment. So tell me, friends, how does old, beloved cinema look to you now? Has it become easier to separate the art from the monsters who created it, or has the golden age lost its shine forever? Write in the comments whose skeleton in the closet shocked you the most, and whether you're willing to forgive your idol's sins for the sake of great performances. Like this exposé series and make sure to subscribe to the channel. We still have many filthy secrets ahead, secrets Hollywood hoped to keep buried forever. Remember, when the spotlights go out, the real monsters crawl into the light. See you in the next episodes.